Picture this, a quiet, forgotten town in the middle of nowhere. A group of friends, young and reckless, looking for adventure on a road trip with no real destination. What starts as a night of laughter, drinks, and bad decisions takes a turn into the unknown. A night that defies explanation. A night that still haunts them to this day. This is a story about a bar that shouldn't have been there. A warning that went unheeded. And a terrifying encounter that left them questioning everything they thought they knew about reality. Settle in, because this isn't just a story. It's a warning. And by the end, you might just find yourself looking over your shoulder, wondering if the shadows are watching you too. Let's begin. I've been sitting on this story for months, trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, replaying every detail, every word, every flicker of light. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Something happened that I can't explain, something that shouldn't be possible. And now, I need to share it with you all because I can't carry this alone anymore. It was late October, and my friends and I were on a road trip through the Midwest. You know the kind. No real destination, just a bunch of us crammed into a beat-up SUV, chasing the horizon and looking for adventure. We'd been driving for hours, the kind of hours where the road starts to feel endless. And the only thing keeping you awake is the promise of the next town, the next stop, the next story to tell. That's how we ended up in Black Hollow. It wasn't on any map, at least not one we could find. We'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. The kind of wrong turn that feels like fate when you're young and stupid and invincible. The town was small, the kind of small where you half expect to see tumbleweeds rolling down the main street. The buildings were old, their facades worn and weathered, like they'd been frozen in time since the 1950s. It was eerie, but in a charming way, like we'd stumbled onto the set of some forgotten Hollywood Western. We were tired, hungry, and more than a little buzzed from the flask we'd been passing around. So when we saw the neon sign flickering in the distance, the rusty spur, we didn't think twice. We parked the car and stumbled inside, laughing and shoving each other like the idiots we were. The bar was strange. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. It was dimly lit, the kind of dim where you can't tell if the lights are intentionally low or just broken. The air smelled like stale beer and something else, something metallic, like copper or rust. The walls were covered in old photos and memorabilia, but they were all faded, like they'd been sitting in the sun for decades. There was a jukebox in the corner, but it wasn't playing anything. The whole place felt off, like we'd walked into a memory instead of a building. The bartender was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with a face that looked like it had seen too much. He didn't smile when we walked in, didn't even look up from the glass he was cleaning. We ordered a round of beers, and he poured them without a word, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was moving through water. "You boys passing through?" he finally asked, his voice gravelly and low. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, "just looking for a place to hang for a bit." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach twist. "Last call's at midnight," he said. "Don't stay past then." We laughed it off, of course. We were young and dumb, and the idea of a curfew in a dive bar in the middle of nowhere was hilarious to us. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The other patrons, there were only a handful of them, were quiet. Too quiet. They didn't talk to each other, didn't even seem to notice us. They just sat there, staring into their drinks like they were waiting for something. And then there were the lights. Every so often, they'd flicker, just for a second, like the power was about to go out. But it never did. It was just enough to make you look up, to make you wonder if you'd imagined it. By the time midnight rolled around, we were the only ones left in the bar. The bartender had disappeared into the back, and the other patrons had slipped out one by one, leaving their drinks half-finished on the tables. We were drunk, loud, and having too much fun to care. So when the clock struck 12 and the bartender reappeared to tell us it was time to go, we ignored him. "Come on, man," my friend Jake said, slamming his empty glass on the bar. "Just one more round." The bartender didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us with those hollow eyes, and for the first time I felt a chill run down my spine. "You don't want to be here after midnight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust me." We laughed again, but it was nervous laughter, the kind you use to cover up the fact that you're scared. "What's the worst that could happen?" I said, trying to sound brave. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, leaving us alone in the bar. That's when the lights flickered again. But this time, they didn't come back on. The bar was plunged into darkness, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly the lights began to return, but they were different now. Dimmer, softer, like they were coming from another time. And that's when I saw them. The bar was full again, but not with the people who had been there before. These were different. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in a history book. The men wore suits and hats, the women in dresses that looked like they belonged in the 1940s. They were laughing, talking, drinking, but their voices were muffled, like they were coming from far away. I turned to my friends, but they were staring at the same thing I was, their faces pale and their eyes wide. "What the hell is going on?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there. But when I turned toward the door, it was gone. The walls of the bar seemed to stretch and warp, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. And then the smell hit me. Smoke, thick, acrid smoke that burned my lungs and made my eyes water. I could hear the crackle of flames, but I couldn't see them. The patrons didn't seem to notice. They just kept laughing, drinking, like nothing was wrong. "We need go," I shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him toward where the door should have been. But no matter how far we ran, we couldn't find it. The bar was endless, a maze of tables and chairs and ghostly figures that seemed to close in around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights came back on, the smoke disappeared, and we were standing in the empty bar again, the clock on the wall showing just past midnight. We didn't stick around to ask questions. We ran out of there as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in the car, speeding down the empty highway. We never talked about what happened that night. Not really. We tried to brush it off, to convince ourselves it was just a bad trip, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see. A few weeks later, I tried to find Black Hollow again. I looked at maps, searched online, even asked around at gas stations and diners. But no one had ever heard of it, and when I finally found the spot where I thought the bar had been, there was nothing there. Just an empty field, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. But here's the thing. When I got out of the car and walked up to that fence, I could still smell it. Smoke. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought I heard the faint sound of laughter, coming from somewhere far away. So did they stumble into some kind of time loop? A ghost story? Or was it just their imaginations running wild?